The little black girl knocked on the motel door, crying her mother's belongings disappeared before sunrise. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. This is the heartbreaking tale of a young girl who faced a terrifying night of fear and loss, and the courageous actions that followed. It was the dead of night when a frantic little girl, barely 8 years old, knocked desperately on the door of a rundown motel room. She was barefoot, her clothes torn, her face streaked with tears. "Please help me," she sobbed, clutching the doorframe as if her life depended on it. She was trembling, barely able to catch her breath. "They took my mom," she cried out, her voice quivering with panic. The motel room was quiet, save for the distant hum of a flickering neon sign outside. Inside, a couple of guests were still awake, but the loudest noise came from the girl's cries. The receptionist, a middle-aged man named Doug, stepped out from behind the counter, his eyes scanning the hallway as he heard the commotion. The girl had run all the way from a nearby street, her footsteps echoing through the parking lot as she desperately sought help. "What happened? Where's your mother?" Doug asked gently, bending down to her level, trying to calm her down. She could barely speak, but between her sobs, she managed to explain that her mother had been there just hours before. The two of them had checked into the motel after a long, exhausting day, but something wasn't right. The girl's mother had gone out late at night, promising she would return soon, but she never came back. What was even stranger was that the girl's mother's belongings, all of them, her purse, her phone, her clothes, had disappeared without a trace. "I tried to wait for her, but I got scared," the girl said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I think someone took her." Doug stood up, looking at the girl with a sense of unease. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how deep the trouble ran. He went back inside, grabbed his jacket, and came back outside to speak with her. "Let's get you inside, all right?" he said, trying to offer her some comfort. But the girl wouldn't let go of the doorframe. "I can't stay here alone. They're coming back for me, too," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows outside. Doug hesitated for a moment, but then, without another word, he picked up the phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. As the phone rang, Doug could feel the weight of the situation press down on him. There was no time to waste. Meanwhile, the little girl clung to him, her fear palpable. Doug couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was unfolding, and that he needed to do whatever it took to protect her. With the sheriff's office on the line, Doug calmly explained the situation, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just a simple missing person case. The girl's mother wasn't the only one in danger. She was too, and there was someone out there who was looking for them both. In that moment, Doug knew he had to act fast, and there was no turning back. As the sound of distant sirens began to fill the air, Doug stood up and looked at the little girl, determination in his eyes. "We're going to find your mom. You're not alone anymore," he promised. The adventure to uncover the mystery and confront the unknown dangers was just beginning. I hope you're ready to hear more, because things are about to get intense. Doug quickly called the sheriff's office, explaining the situation with the little girl and her missing mother. As the dispatcher assured him that help was on the way, Doug could feel the weight of the moment. He knew time was running out. The girl, still trembling with fear, clung to Doug's side, her wide eyes constantly darting to the dark corners of the motel parking lot. "They'll come for me too," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. Doug crouched down to her level, trying to comfort her. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. We'll find your mom," he said with a calmness he didn't feel. Despite his reassuring words, Doug couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was at play. The girl's desperation was real. The way she looked at him, pleading for help, made him realize that this was more than just a simple missing persons case. The fear in her eyes told him there was something much deeper and much more dangerous going on. Moments later, the sound of a police siren grew louder, and Doug quickly led the girl into the motel lobby, where they sat down in the small waiting area. Doug kept his eyes on the entrance, waiting for the sheriff's deputy to arrive. As the siren grew closer, the door opened, and a young officer stepped in. Deputy Jennifer Clark was in her late 20s, with a no-nonsense attitude that made Doug feel a little better. She was followed by another officer, a tall man named Officer Mark Stevens, who seemed to be taking everything in with a sharp eye. "What's going on here?" Deputy Clark asked as she approached Doug and the girl. Doug quickly explained the situation. The little girl had found him after her mother disappeared, and now they were both in danger. The girl had told Doug that her mom had been acting strangely before she vanished. "Do you know where your mom went?" Deputy Clark asked the girl gently. The girl shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "She just left, and all her stuff is gone. I looked everywhere." "All her stuff?" Deputy Clark pressed. "Like what?" "Her purse, her phone, everything. She took nothing. I looked under the bed, in the closet, and it was all gone." The officer exchanged a glance with Officer Stevens. They both seemed to know something Doug didn't. "Where did your mom go? What was she doing here?" Deputy Clark asked. "I don't know," the girl replied, her voice cracking. "She said she was going out for a little while, but she didn't come back. She promised she would. She always promises." Doug could see the wheels turning in Deputy Clark's head. Something wasn't adding up. The girl's mother wasn't just missing. There was more to this story than met the eye. "We'll take it from here," Deputy Clark said, her tone firm. "But we need you to stay here. You're safe now." The girl nodded, but Doug could tell she wasn't convinced. "I'm not leaving her," Doug said, his voice resolute. "I made a promise to her father, and I'm not going to let her down now." Deputy Clark studied Doug for a moment, then nodded. "All right, stay with her, but stay out of the way. We're going to need to gather evidence and figure out what's really going on." Doug agreed, but his instincts told him that the danger was far from over. As the officers set to work, Doug couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. Something about this situation was too suspicious, too strange. This wasn't just a missing persons case. He needed to get to the bottom of it. The motel was quiet, too quiet for Doug's liking, as the officers started questioning the few guests still awake. Doug kept his eyes on the girl, who was still sitting nervously, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "We're going to find your mom, I promise," he whispered. The girl looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Please, I don't want to be alone," she said, her voice trembling. Doug felt a pang of guilt. He had made that promise to her father, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't just a search for a missing mother. It was the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous situation. As the officers continued their investigation, Doug quietly pulled out his phone and made a call. He needed to speak to someone he trusted, someone who could help him get to the truth. There was no turning back now. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the motel became increasingly tense. Doug sat with the little girl, now identified as Aisha Coleman, his mind racing with questions. What had really happened to her mother? Why had she disappeared without a trace, leaving behind all of her personal belongings? There were too many unanswered questions, and each one seemed to lead to a darker and more complex mystery. Deputy Clark and Officer Stevens continued their investigation, questioning guests and reviewing the motel's security footage. The rest of the staff was on edge, watching the proceedings closely, but Doug remained focused on Aisha. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the danger was closer than they thought. Aisha's eyes were red and puffy from crying, her small hands tightly clutching the sleeves of Doug's jacket. She had stopped speaking, but her silent fear was louder than words. "Do you think they'll find her?" Aisha finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Doug looked down at the little girl, trying to offer a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. "We're doing everything we can," he said. "We'll find your mom. I promise you." Aisha nodded slowly, but Doug could tell she didn't believe him. It wasn't just her mother that had gone missing. Aisha had lost her sense of safety, too. She had trusted her mother, relied on her, and now that trust was shattered. Doug's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from his contact in the local police department. The message was short but alarming. "We found something. Meet me at the station." Doug's heart skipped a beat. "Stay here with the officers," he told Aisha, standing up and quickly moving toward the door. "I'll be right back." Deputy Clark looked up as Doug approached, her face serious. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I got a lead," Doug said quickly. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Keep her safe." Deputy Clark nodded, her eyes sharp. Don't take any unnecessary risks, she warned. Doug gave a brief nod and stepped out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet as he made his way to the police station. His mind raced, wondering what he would find. Whatever it was big. When he arrived, his contact, Detective Lisa Morgan, was waiting for him outside the station. She was a seasoned investigator, someone Doug trusted, and her expression told him everything he needed to know. Something had gone terribly wrong. What did you find? Doug asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Detective Morgan motioned for him to follow her inside. They entered the dimly lit office, and she handed him a folder. Take a look at this, she said, her voice low. Doug opened the folder, and his eyes scanned the contents. There were photos, police reports, and documents detailing an investigation that had been ongoing for months. As he read through the papers, a chilling realization washed over him. Aisha's mother, named Cynthia, had been involved in something much bigger than Doug could have imagined. The reports revealed that Cynthia had been working with a group involved in organized crime. Her association with the group was not just by chance, it was deliberate. She had been hiding in plain sight, trying to escape her past, but someone had found her, and now Aisha was caught in the middle. She was running from someone, Doug muttered, looking up at Detective Morgan. And now they've found her. Detective Morgan nodded grimly. It's worse than we thought. Cynthia wasn't just a victim in all this. She was a key player, and her disappearance is part of a bigger game. Doug's mind spun as he tried to process what he had just learned. If Aisha's mother was involved in criminal activity, it explained why she had been so secretive, but it didn't explain why she had disappeared now, when everything seemed to be settling down. Doug felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. The little girl he had promised to protect was in the middle of a dangerous web of lies and violence. There was no turning back now. Doug looked at Detective Morgan. We need to find Aisha's mom, and fast, he said, his voice firm. And we need to keep Aisha safe. Detective Morgan's eyes hardened. I'll send a team to gather more information. We'll find her, Doug. But we need to act quickly. Doug nodded. But in his heart, he feared the worst. Whoever was after Cynthia wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted, and that might include Aisha. As Doug left the police station, he felt the weight of the night settling over him. The streets were empty, the world around him silent. But in his gut, he knew the storm was just beginning, and he would do whatever it took to keep Aisha safe. The clock was ticking, and every moment that passed brought them closer to the unknown. Doug's thoughts raced as he made his way back to the motel. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows around him felt darker now, more ominous. But there was no time to waste. He had promised Aisha's father that he would protect her, and that promise meant everything. There was no turning back. Not now. I hope you're ready for more, because the stakes just got higher. After receiving the chilling news from Detective Morgan, Doug felt his resolve harden. He quickly made his way back to the motel, where Aisha was waiting, still in the same spot, her small hands nervously twisting the sleeves of Doug's jacket. He could see her exhaustion, but more than that, he could see her fear. She had been through so much already, and now the truth was becoming clearer. Her mother wasn't just missing, she was in danger. Doug approached the front desk, where Deputy Clark was speaking with Officer Stevens, her face tense as she listened to a report. As soon as she saw Doug, she nodded and motioned him over. We've got a lead on the vehicle, Deputy Clark said, her voice steady, but Doug could tell she was just as worried as he was. The silver SUV was spotted heading toward the old industrial park on the outskirts of town. It's not far, but we don't know who we're dealing with yet. Doug didn't waste another second. He turned to Aisha, crouching down to meet her eyes. I need you to stay here with the officers, all right? Aisha nodded, her lips trembling. Will you find my mom? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Doug gave her a soft smile, though it was hard to muster the strength to do so. We'll find her, I promise you. Stay safe. Without waiting for a response, Doug followed Deputy Clark and Officer Stevens out to their patrol cars, his heart pounding in his chest. The night air was thick with tension, and the drive to the industrial park felt like it took forever. Doug's mind raced with possibilities. Who would take a mother and leave a child behind? Was it just a random act of violence, or was there something more to it? As they pulled up to the industrial park, Doug's stomach twisted. The area was dark, desolate, and surrounded by abandoned warehouses. The faint sound of a lone train in the distance only added to the eerie atmosphere. Deputy Clark parked the patrol car, and they all stepped out. "We need to be careful," she warned, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. "Stay close, and keep your heads down." Doug nodded, his body tense as they made their way toward the first building. The area was silent except for the occasional creak of metal or the distant howling wind. Doug's senses were on high alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "We'll go in quietly," Deputy Clark said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one makes a move unless I say so." They approached the entrance of the warehouse, the cold air biting at Doug's skin. As they stepped inside, Doug's heart skipped a beat. There, in the center of the warehouse, was a familiar silver SUV. It was parked haphazardly, its engine still warm. Doug's breath caught in his throat. This was it. They had found it. But where was Aisha's mother? The officers began to spread out, searching the area. Doug's mind raced as he scanned the room, looking for any sign of life. Then, he heard it. A faint sound, almost like a moan. Without thinking, Doug rushed toward the source of the sound, pushing past debris and old crates. He found her then. Cynthia, Aisha's mother, was slumped against the wall, her face bruised and pale. She looked like she had been through hell, but she was still alive. Doug knelt down beside her, checking her vitals. She was breathing, but barely. "Cynthia," Doug said, his voice soft but urgent. "It's Doug. You're going to be okay. We're here to help." Cynthia's eyes fluttered open, and she groaned, barely able to focus. They came for me," she whispered hoarsely. I didn't know what to do." "It's all right," Doug said, trying to keep her calm. "We're going to get you out of here. You're safe now." He looked up at Deputy Clark, who was already on the radio, calling for an ambulance. But just as Doug thought things were under control, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. His heart raced as he realized they weren't alone. He quickly helped Cynthia to her feet, trying to keep her steady. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Doug's instincts kicked in. "Get ready," he whispered to the officers, his hand reaching for his own gun. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and then the door was kicked open with a force that made Doug's blood run cold. Standing in the doorway were two men, their faces obscured by masks. They were armed, and they didn't look like they had any intention of letting anyone leave alive. "You shouldn't have followed us here," one of the men said, his voice cold and menacing. Deputy Clark immediately raised her gun, but Doug stepped in front of her. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let her go. We're taking her with us." The men laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that sent chills down Doug's spine. "You think you can just walk out of here with her?" the second man sneered. "This is our business, and we don't let anyone interfere." Doug's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that things were about to escalate. But just as the tension in the room reached its peak, there was a sudden burst of movement. The officers quickly took cover, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the warehouse. Doug's breath caught in his throat as chaos erupted around him. There was no turning back now. The fight for Aisha's mother had just begun. "I hope you're ready for more, because things are heating up." The warehouse erupted into chaos as the sound of gunfire echoed through the dimly lit room. Doug's heart raced as he instinctively pushed Cynthia behind him, his eyes darting to the officers. Deputy Clark and Officer Stevens quickly took cover, returning fire as the two masked men advanced. Doug could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, but his mind remained focused on the mission, getting Cynthia out of here alive. The two men, armed and ready to fight, had no intention of letting them leave without a confrontation. Doug knew this wasn't just about Cynthia anymore. It was about survival. The bullets flew past them, embedding into the walls and concrete pillars of the warehouse. Doug could hear the screams of the officers as they scrambled to stay safe, but his attention was fixed on the masked men. They were relentless, their eyes filled with a cold, calculated determination. Doug knew they had to be connected to the larger criminal operation Cynthia had been involved with. This wasn't a random attack. This was personal. The man in the front, the one who had spoken earlier, took a step forward, his gun aimed straight at Doug. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice laced with venom. "This is our turf, and nobody walks away." Doug's mind raced as he assessed the situation. He had to make a move, and fast. The officers were holding their ground, but they were outnumbered. If they didn't act quickly, they'd be overrun. He couldn't let that happen. Without thinking, Doug dove behind a large metal crate, pulling Cynthia with him. She was still weak, but her fear was evident. "We need to get you out of here," Doug said, his voice urgent. "Hold on tight." He quickly surveyed the area, looking for an escape route. The door was still open, but the men were blocking the path. He couldn't risk trying to make a run for it without some cover. He looked to his left, where he saw Officer Stevens signaling him. The officer had a plan. Doug gave a quick nod and moved, following Stevens' lead. The two officers worked in perfect sync, covering each other as they maneuvered around the warehouse. Doug stayed close to Cynthia, making sure she was protected as they moved. The gunfire continued to ring out, but Doug's focus never wavered. They were close to the exit now, just a few steps away, when the second man spotted them. He aimed his gun at Doug, his finger tightening on the trigger. Doug barely had time to react, but he dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet that skimmed past him. The shot hit the wall with a deafening crack, sending shards of concrete flying. Doug quickly regained his footing, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let this man stop them. With all his strength, Doug rushed forward, knocking the gunman off balance. The two men collided, falling to the ground in a tangled mess. Doug scrambled to maintain control, but the man was strong, and the struggle was fierce. Cynthia cried out behind him, and Doug's heart sank. He couldn't let anything happen to her. With a surge of energy, Doug managed to overpower the man, knocking the gun from his hand. He quickly grabbed it, pointing it at the man's face. "Stay down," Doug growled, his voice filled with authority. The man, now lying flat on the ground, raised his hands in surrender. Doug didn't hesitate. "Get up and get out," he ordered. The man scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. He knew he was beaten. As he backed away, Doug quickly turned to Cynthia, making sure she was all right. She was shaken, her body trembling, but she was alive. "Are you okay?" Doug asked, his voice softer now. Cynthia nodded, her eyes still wide with terror. "I don't know who they are," she whispered. "But they've been after me for months. I tried to get away, but—" Her voice trailed off, and Doug could see the pain in her eyes. "You're safe now," Doug said, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll get you out of here." With the immediate danger gone, Doug motioned for the officers to follow. They quickly made their way toward the exit, staying low and moving swiftly. As they approached the door, Doug could hear sirens in the distance. Reinforcements were on the way, but they couldn't afford to wait. "Move, now," Doug urged. The group rushed out into the night, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. Doug didn't look back, but he knew they couldn't stop yet. There were still questions to be answered, and Cynthia's past was catching up with her. The night wasn't over, and Doug knew they would face more challenges before this was all over. But for now, they were safe. They had survived the night, and that was all that mattered. The next step was clear. They had to get Cynthia to safety, and they had to do it fast. "I hope you're ready, because the tension is about to rise." As Doug and the officers made their way down the dark streets, their steps were quick but cautious. The night had been long, but the danger was far from over. Cynthia, who had been holding on to Doug for dear life, still looked pale and shaken. Her eyes darted nervously, as if expecting someone to jump out from behind every corner. Doug could feel her fear, but he knew they had to keep moving. The sound of sirens was growing louder, signaling that backup was getting closer. But Doug couldn't afford to wait for them. He had made a promise to Aisha's father, and he was determined to keep it. They reached Doug's car, and without a word, he opened the door for Cynthia, guiding her inside. He slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The urgency in his chest was undeniable. Every second felt like a lifetime. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading towards the outskirts of town. The officers followed in their own vehicles, keeping a safe distance. "Where are we going?" Cynthia asked, her voice weak but steady. "You're going to be safe," Doug replied, his tone reassuring but firm. "We're getting you out of town for now. We need to figure out what's going on, but we can't do it here." Cynthia nodded, her hands trembling as she held the seat. "I can't go back to my house," she said, her voice cracking. "They'll find me again." Doug didn't respond immediately. He knew exactly what she meant. Whoever was after her wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and right now, Cynthia was the key. "We'll make sure they don't find you," Doug said, his voice softening. But we need to know who they are and why they're doing this. Cynthia remained silent, staring out the window as the landscape passed by. Doug could feel the weight of her past pressing down on them, but he couldn't dwell on it right now. There were bigger questions at play, and the clock was ticking. They reached a safe house on the edge of town, a small, unassuming house that Doug used for situations like this. It was a place where people in danger could lay low until things settled down. Doug parked the car and turned off the engine. He looked over at Cynthia. "Stay here for now," he said. "I'll make sure everything's set up. You'll be safe here until we figure out what's really going on." Cynthia nodded, her face pale but relieved. She stepped out of the car and walked into the house, her steps hesitant but determined. Doug followed her inside, locking the door behind them. He quickly moved to the back of the house, where a small office was set up. His first priority was to contact the people who could help, his network of contacts in law enforcement and private investigation. He dialed the number of a trusted friend, someone who could get answers fast. As the phone rang, Doug's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but there were still too many unknowns. Why was Cynthia's past catching up with her now? And why had they targeted Aisha's family? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The phone clicked, and Doug's contact answered on the other end. "Doug," the voice on the other end said. "What's going on? You said it was urgent." "It is," Doug replied. "I need information on a woman named Cynthia Coleman. I believe she's been involved with a criminal organization, and now someone's after her. I need to know everything you can find." There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice responded. "I can get you that information, but it's going to take some time. The people we're dealing with are dangerous. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Doug's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't have a choice. She's in danger, and her daughter's at risk too. I need to know who's behind this." "All right," the voice said. "I'll get back to you soon. Just be careful. You're dealing with some serious people." Doug hung up the phone and turned back to the room where Cynthia was sitting, waiting. He walked over to her, taking a seat beside her. "We're going to get through this," he said, trying to offer reassurance, even though he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. "But we need to figure out who's after you and why. And we need to do it fast." Cynthia nodded but said nothing. The fear in her eyes told Doug everything he needed to know. She was terrified of what was coming. Doug stood up and walked toward the window, his eyes scanning the dark street outside. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. He had to be ready for whatever came next. As he watched the streetlights flicker in the distance, he couldn't help but feel that they were being watched. Someone was out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The stakes were higher than ever, and Doug knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. With the night stretching ahead of them, he turned back to Cynthia. "Stay here and don't open the door for anyone unless it's me," he said, his voice firm. "I'll be back soon. We'll get through this, I promise." Cynthia didn't respond, but her eyes met his, and in that moment, Doug knew she was trusting him with her life, and he would do everything in his power to keep that trust. He stepped out into the night, the door clicking shut behind him, and as he made his way down the dark street, he couldn't help but wonder, how deep did this go? And who was really behind the threat that had landed them here? The answers were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. I hope you're ready for more, because the danger is far from over. After Doug left Cynthia in the safe house, he made his way to the edge of town where his mind raced with the terrifying reality of the situation. He still didn't have all the answers, but he was closing in on the truth. He had to figure out who was behind the attack on Cynthia and why they were targeting her. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that there was something bigger at play here. He couldn't afford to make any missteps. He pulled into an old diner, one that he knew had a history of serving people who needed to lay low. Doug stepped inside, looking for someone he could trust. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, the only sound coming from the clinking of silverware and the low hum of the jukebox in the corner. At the counter sat a man named Frank, an old contact who had connections to the underground world. Frank's eyes met Doug's as soon as he walked in, and without a word, he slid off his stool and motioned for Doug to join him. "You've got that look," Frank said, his gravelly voice matching his rugged appearance. "What's going on?" Doug sat down, his gaze scanning the room before locking eyes with Frank. "I need information on a group, Frank. People connected to organized crime. I think they're after a woman named Cynthia Coleman, and I need to know everything I can about them. Her daughter's at risk too." Frank raised an eyebrow. Cynthia Coleman? I thought she got out of the game years ago. What's she doing back in this mess? Doug shook his head. I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think her disappearance wasn't a random thing. This is bigger than we thought. Frank nodded, his expression turning serious. All right, I'll see what I can dig up. But you better be careful, Doug. These people play dirty, and they don't care who they hurt. Doug felt the weight of Frank's words sink in. He knew Frank had been in the business long enough to know when trouble was brewing, and Doug was starting to realize just how deep this went. I'm not backing down, Doug said firmly. I made a promise, and I intend to keep it. Frank eyed him for a moment before nodding. I'll get on it, but you need to lay low for a while. If these people are watching, you don't want them finding you or Cynthia. Doug agreed, but his mind kept returning to Aisha. What kind of life had she lived while her mother was caught up in this world? She was just a kid, and now she was in the middle of something she didn't deserve. Frank slipped a small envelope across the counter. This should help. It's a list of names, associates. It's not much, but it's a start. Doug grabbed the envelope, his fingers brushing against Frank's rough hands. Thanks, Doug said, standing up. I'll be in touch. He left the diner with a feeling of unease hanging in the air. The list in his hand was a clue, but it wasn't enough to piece together the full picture. As he drove back to the safe house, Doug couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Every turn, every movement felt wrong. He checked the rearview mirror once again, but saw nothing unusual. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that they weren't alone. As he pulled up to the house, he noticed something odd. Cynthia's car was gone. The house was quiet, too quiet. Doug's heart raced as he stepped out of the car and approached the door, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun in his waistband. He pushed open the door slowly, making sure not to make a sound. Cynthia, he called out softly. No answer. He stepped further inside, the floor creaking under his weight. The house was empty, but the air felt heavy, as though something had happened. Doug moved through the house, checking every room, but there was no sign of Cynthia. Panic set in. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of the officer who had been helping him. No answer. He tried again, and again, but the phone just kept ringing. Doug knew something was wrong. He stepped outside, looking around the yard, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. His instincts were telling him that they were being followed, that someone was waiting for them to slip up. The sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance. Doug's heart pounded in his chest as he watched a black sedan slowly drive by. He ducked behind the porch wall, holding his breath. The car didn't stop, but Doug was certain it had been watching them. He waited for several minutes, trying to shake the feeling of being hunted. After what felt like an eternity, Doug stood up and made his way back to the car. It was time to regroup. He had to find Cynthia, and he had to find her fast. As he started the engine and pulled away, he couldn't help but wonder, who was behind this? And what did they want with Cynthia and her daughter? The answers were still out there, but they were getting closer, and the more Doug uncovered, the more dangerous things were becoming. I hope you're ready for more, because things are about to get even more dangerous. Doug had barely made it to the car when his phone rang. It was Detective Morgan. His heart skipped a beat as he answered the call. Doug, we've got a problem. Morgan's voice crackled through the phone. Cynthia's been moved. We've tracked down her last known location, but it looks like they knew we were coming. Doug's blood ran cold. What do you mean, they knew? He asked, his voice tight. The men we've been tracking, the ones behind her disappearance, they've been one step ahead. Someone tipped them off. We think Cynthia was moved just before we arrived. Doug felt his stomach drop. Where is she now? He demanded. Morgan hesitated for a moment. We believe she's being held at an abandoned factory out near Highway 75. It's in a desolate area, no one goes there. But it's the perfect place for them to hide her. Doug's mind raced. I'm on my way. He hung up the phone without waiting for a response, his thoughts focused on one thing, getting to Cynthia before it was too late. He threw the car into drive, peeling out of the safe house driveway and onto the road. The air felt thick, heavy with the kind of tension that only came when time was running out. He couldn't afford to waste a second. The lights of the highway blurred in his rearview mirror as he sped toward the factory. He couldn't shake the image of Aisha, waiting in that safe house, and he had to find her mother before anything else happened. The sky was darkening, the world around him fading into a blur of blackness and streaks of light. As he approached the factory district, Doug's nerves began to spike. The factories were old, abandoned and decaying. The area was a maze of rusted metal and crumbling brick, a perfect hiding spot for someone trying to stay off the radar. He pulled off the main road and took a smaller side street leading into the heart of the district. The eerie silence that surrounded the area made his skin crawl. His headlights illuminated the rundown buildings in front of him, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. There was no sign of life, just the haunting silence of a place long forgotten. Doug parked his car behind an abandoned warehouse, crouching low as he stepped out and moved toward the factory. His instincts told him that they were getting close. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was waiting for them. He crept toward the entrance of the factory, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the faint sound of muffled voices in the distance. They were here. Doug's pulse quickened as he moved closer, his hand on the grip of his gun. He was ready for whatever came next. He peeked around the corner, careful not to make a sound. Inside the factory, he could see a group of men moving around, their faces obscured by shadows. In the center of the room, Cynthia was kneeling on the ground, her hands bound behind her back. The men were talking, their voices low and threatening, but Doug couldn't make out the words. He had to act fast. Without hesitation, Doug signaled to the officers who had followed him. They were positioned at different points around the factory, waiting for his signal. The moment Doug gave the word, they would move in. But as he moved closer to the factory, the door suddenly creaked open. Doug froze. One of the men stepped outside, scanning the area. Doug quickly ducked behind a stack of crates, holding his breath. The man stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the shadows. Doug remained as still as possible, praying the man wouldn't spot him. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned and went back inside. Doug let out a silent sigh of relief. It was now or never. He took a deep breath, stepped out from behind the crates, and made his move. With swift, calculated steps, he approached the factory entrance. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was focused on one thing, getting Cynthia out of there. He slipped inside the factory, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The men were still gathered around Cynthia, but they hadn't noticed him yet. He moved silently, taking cover behind an old rusted machine. He waited for the right moment. The men were distracted, arguing about something. Doug didn't hesitate. He made his way towards Cynthia, his hand outstretched. "Cynthia, we're getting you out of here," he whispered, crouching down next to her. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with both fear and relief. "You found me," she whispered hoarsely. Doug nodded, his voice steady. "Stay low and follow my lead." Just as he helped her to her feet, a shout rang out from behind them. One of the men had seen them. "Hey, they're here," the man yelled, drawing his gun. Chaos erupted in the factory. Doug pushed Cynthia behind him as bullets began to fly. The officers who had been waiting outside rushed in, guns drawn. Doug returned fire, his body moving on instinct as he shielded Cynthia. The men didn't stand a chance. The officers were trained, and within moments, the threat was neutralized. Doug pulled Cynthia to safety, moving quickly as they exited the factory. The sound of sirens grew louder, signaling that the authorities were on their way. But for now, they were safe. Doug knew the battle was far from over, but tonight, they had won. Cynthia was safe, and that was all that mattered. For now, I hope you're still with me, because the story is far from over. Doug had barely caught his breath after the chaos in the factory when his phone rang again. It was Detective Morgan. Her voice was urgent, and Doug could tell something was wrong. "Doug, we've got another problem," she said, her tone sharp. "We tracked down the group behind Cynthia's disappearance. It's bigger than we thought. There's a connection to a larger syndicate. You need to get back here now." Doug's heart sank. He thought they were done with the immediate threat, but now it was clear that things were only just beginning. "I'm on my way," Doug replied, already starting the engine. He looked at Cynthia, still shaken but alive, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "We need to move, now," Doug said, his voice low. Cynthia nodded, though her hands shook. Doug didn't have time to reassure her, but he needed to get her to safety. As they sped toward the police station, Doug couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was spiraling out of control. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but each revelation made the stakes higher. It wasn't just Cynthia and her daughter at risk, it was everyone around them. They couldn't let these people win. As Doug parked in front of the station, he noticed a black car parked nearby. It was too clean, too new to blend in with the surroundings. His instincts screamed at him to stay alert. Cynthia noticed it too. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Doug didn't answer, instead moving toward the door of the station. As he stepped inside, Detective Morgan was waiting for him. "Doug," she began, her expression grave. "This just got a lot more complicated." She handed him a folder filled with information. "This is what we've found so far. The group we're dealing with is connected to a major human trafficking operation. They're trying to clean up their tracks, but we've got enough evidence to hit them where it hurts." Doug scanned the papers quickly, his eyes widening. He knew things were bad, but this was worse than he had imagined. The operation was large, organized, and deeply embedded in the community. "How did they get involved with Cynthia?" Doug asked, his voice cold. "We don't know the full story yet, but it looks like she got in too deep," Morgan replied. "She was being used, Doug. This wasn't just about money or power, it's about control." Doug's mind was racing. He thought back to the moment when he first met Cynthia. She had seemed like a victim, but now it seemed like she had been trapped in a much darker world than he had realized. He looked at Morgan. "We need to move fast. We can't let them regroup." Morgan nodded. "We've got a plan. We're going to hit them where it hurts, their money, their operations. But we need you, Doug. You know the streets, you know the people. We can't do this without your help." Doug felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't a detective, but he had spent enough time on the streets to know how things worked. He could do this. He had to. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "We've identified several key locations," Morgan replied, her tone firm. "They're moving their operations and trying to lay low. We need to catch them off guard." Doug nodded. "Let's do it." No more waiting. The plan was set. Doug, Detective Morgan, and a team of officers would raid the locations one by one, working in coordination to shut down the syndicate's operations. But Doug knew they were up against something much bigger. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to move out, Doug couldn't help but feel that they were walking into a trap. He turned to Cynthia, who was sitting in the corner, still shaking. "Stay here, all right? We're going to take care of this," Doug said softly. Cynthia nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude but also fear. "Be careful," she whispered. Doug gave her a reassuring smile, but his mind was already focused on the task ahead. He couldn't let his guard down. The team moved quickly, their cars pulling out of the station and heading toward their first target. The streets were eerily quiet as they drove through the city, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. Doug's heart raced as they approached the location, an old warehouse on the edge of town. This was the first of many places they had to hit. It was now or never. As they parked their cars and prepared to breach the building, Doug looked around at the officers, all of them ready for whatever was coming next. They had come this far, and they couldn't back down now. With a signal from Detective Morgan, the team moved in. Doug's breath caught in his throat as he heard the sound of heavy footsteps inside the warehouse. They were close. He signaled to the officers to take their positions. The moment of truth had arrived. The door burst open, and they flooded into the building. Doug's eyes scanned the room, his mind already working to identify the threats. The warehouse was dark, filled with the scent of stale air and metal. But there was no time to hesitate. The operation had begun. They moved quickly, clearing rooms, checking corners, and making sure no one was left behind. The tension in the air was palpable, but Doug remained focused. He wasn't going to let them slip away again. Suddenly, the sound of gunshots echoed in the distance, and Doug's heart stopped. He turned to the officers. "Stay close. We're not done yet. The battle was just beginning. I hope you're ready for the next chapter, because things are about to get even more intense." The warehouse was a maze of dimly lit corridors and broken walls. Doug's heart was pounding in his chest as they moved deeper into the building. He could hear the sounds of footsteps and the distant echo of gunfire. The team was moving fast, each officer in their assigned position, checking every corner, every shadow. Doug's mind raced as he focused on the task at hand. He needed to find the source of the operation, the people behind the trafficking ring, and he needed to do it before anyone else got hurt. "Keep moving," Detective Morgan whispered, signaling to Doug as they approached a set of stairs leading to the second floor. Doug nodded, his grip tightening around his weapon. The air in the warehouse felt thick, heavy with the weight of the situation. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. They couldn't afford to lose anyone. They reached the top of the stairs and found themselves in a large, open room filled with crates and boxes. The flickering lights above cast long, unsettling shadows, making the room feel even more isolated. Doug moved quickly, scanning the area for any signs of movement. But all was quiet. Too quiet. "We're close," Morgan said, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the chaos unfolding below. "But we need to be careful. There could be more of them." Doug's eyes narrowed. He was ready for whatever came next. They continued forward, but just as Doug turned a corner, a figure appeared in the doorway, a gun aimed straight at them. "Freeze," the man shouted, his voice hoarse with authority. Without thinking, Doug dove to the side, taking cover behind a stack of crates. "Go, go," he yelled to the team. The officers immediately returned fire, their shots ringing out in the dimly lit space. Doug's heart raced as he watched the gunman retreat into the shadows, but he didn't let up. The team quickly moved into position, covering each other as they advanced. Doug's eyes were fixed on the man, who was now disappearing deeper into the building. "This way, Doug," ordered, motioning for the others to follow. They moved quickly, staying low and silent, their footsteps barely making a sound against the cold concrete floor. As they rounded another corner, they found themselves face to face with a large, locked door. Doug didn't hesitate. He pulled out his breaching tool and moved toward the door. "We need to get inside," he said, his voice sharp. The officers quickly moved into position, ready to breach the door. Doug took a deep breath, focusing on the task ahead. As the door burst open, they were met with a surprising sight. The room was filled with crates of high-end merchandise, but what caught Doug's attention was the row of monitors lined up on a desk in the corner. The screens were showing live footage from various locations, street corners, buildings, and even the safe house where they had been keeping Cynthia. It was clear that the people behind this operation had eyes everywhere. Doug's blood ran cold as he realized the full extent of the situation. This was no longer just about trafficking. It was a coordinated effort to control everything and everyone involved. "They've been watching us," Doug muttered, his voice dark with realization. Morgan stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. "This is their nerve center," she said, her tone grim. "We need to shut this down now." Doug nodded, his mind racing. They couldn't let these people continue their operation. They couldn't let them hurt anyone else. He quickly moved to the monitors, trying to figure out how to disable the system. As he worked, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Without warning, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Doug turned, his heart pounding. The man from earlier stepped into the room, a gun in hand. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice laced with venom. Doug's mind raced as he realized that this was the moment he had been dreading. The man was part of the syndicate, and now they were face to face. The officers quickly moved to position themselves, but Doug could tell the odds weren't in their favor. The gunman grinned, taking a step forward. "You think you can stop us? You think you can take us down? You're too late." Doug's blood boiled, but he kept his cool. "We've already won," Doug said, his voice steady. "This ends now." With a swift move, Doug lunged toward the man, knocking the gun from his hand. The two struggled, but Doug's experience in these types of situations gave him the upper hand. He quickly overpowered the man, pinning him to the ground. "Get him out of here," Doug ordered, breathing heavily. The officers quickly moved to restrain the man and take him into custody. As they moved him out of the room, Doug turned to the monitors and began disabling the system. It took a few moments, but finally, the screens went black. Doug exhaled, relief washing over him. The operation was finally neutralized. They had taken down the heart of the syndicate, but Doug knew there was still more work to be done. The fight wasn't over. Cynthia was safe for now, but they had to make sure the rest of the operation was dismantled, that no one else was left in danger. Doug walked over to the door, looking back at the room one last time. The man who had been threatening them earlier was now gone, and the warehouse was quiet once again. But Doug knew that this victory came at a high cost. He had to protect those who were still at risk. As he stepped out of the room and into the night, Doug felt a sense of determination settle in. He would see this through to the end, no matter what. There was no going back now. "I hope you're still with me, because the tension is only rising." Doug stepped out of the warehouse, his mind still processing what had just happened. They had taken down the core of the syndicate, but he knew it wasn't over. The night felt heavier now, the air thick with uncertainty. The officers moved quickly, securing the area, but Doug couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something lurking in the shadows. He had to get back to Cynthia and Aisha, but he knew the danger wasn't over. The road to safety was longer than he had imagined. As he got into his car and drove toward the safe house, his phone rang. It was Detective Morgan. Doug's heart sank as he answered. "Doug, I need you to listen carefully." Morgan's voice crackled through the phone. "We've been compromised. One of the officers we had on the inside is working for them." Doug's mind went blank for a moment. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to make sense of what Morgan was saying. "I've been going through the files," Morgan continued, "and I found some connections. One of the officers who was supposed to be helping us has been passing information to the syndicate. They knew exactly what we were planning. That's how they got away last time. It wasn't just luck." Doug's blood ran cold. "Who is it?" "It's Officer Stevens," Morgan replied. "He's been playing both sides, and now that we've hit the syndicate, he's disappeared. We think he's the one who tipped them off about our raid." Doug's fists clenched around the steering wheel. "I can't believe it," he muttered under his breath. "How could we have missed this?" Morgan's voice was calm but firm. "We need to act fast. Stevens is going to try and warn the others, and if he's still working with them, we could be walking into another trap. You need to get back to the safe house and keep Cynthia and Aisha hidden. I'm sending backup, but we're going to need to take Stevens down before he can do any more damage." Doug slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration. He had trusted Officer Stevens. He had trusted everyone who was supposed to be on their side. And now, that trust had been shattered. "I'll take care of it," Doug said, his voice steady despite the rage boiling inside him. "Just get the backup here." He hung up and immediately made his way back to the safe house. The urgency in his step grew with every mile. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. Cynthia and Aisha were depending on him, and he wouldn't let them down. When he reached the safe house, Doug parked his car in the driveway and quickly checked the surroundings. Everything seemed normal, but Doug's instincts were screaming at him. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. They were close to the end game, but it wasn't just the syndicate they had to worry about anymore. Officer Stevens, the man they had trusted, had become their biggest threat. Doug moved cautiously toward the door, his eyes scanning the shadows. He wasn't taking any chances. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, everything was quiet. Cynthia was sitting on the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. Aisha was in the corner, her face hidden behind her knees. Doug's heart ached as he took in the scene. The last thing he wanted was to bring them more danger. "Are you okay?" Doug asked, his voice low as he approached Cynthia. She looked up, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "I heard sirens," she said softly. "What's happening? Are we safe?" Doug nodded, though the uncertainty in his own heart gnawed at him. "For now," he replied, "but we need to stay alert. We've got a problem." Cynthia's expression shifted as she looked up at him. "What kind of problem?" Doug hesitated. "It's Stevens. He's been working for the syndicate. He's the one who tipped them off about the raid. He's the reason they got away last time." Cynthia's eyes widened in shock. "I knew something wasn't right," she whispered. "But I didn't think it was him." Doug nodded. "I didn't either. But now we have to deal with him before he does any more damage." Just then, Doug heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. His heart skipped a beat. "Stay inside," he ordered Cynthia and Aisha. He quickly moved to the window and peeked outside. It was Officer Stevens' car. Doug's pulse quickened as he realized what was happening. Stevens had found them. He wasn't coming to help. He was here to finish what the syndicate had started. Doug had no choice but to act fast. He grabbed his phone and texted Detective Morgan. "Stevens is here. We need backup now." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and grabbed his weapon. His heart was racing as he moved toward the door, ready to confront the man who had betrayed them all. He couldn't afford to hesitate. This was it. Doug knew Stevens would be armed and dangerous, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had to protect Cynthia and Aisha. They had already been through enough. With one last look at the two women, Doug stepped outside, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He could hear Stevens moving around the side of the house, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Doug's instincts kicked in, and he quickly moved to intercept. He wasn't going to let Stevens hurt anyone else. As Stevens turned the corner, Doug stepped out of the shadows. "It's over, Stevens," Doug said, his voice steady but filled with authority. Stevens froze, his hand moving toward his weapon. But before he could react, Doug was already on him. The struggle was fast, brutal, but Doug had the upper hand. He wasn't going to let the man get away again. The fight ended quickly, and Stevens was on the ground, pinned by Doug. "You're done," Doug said, his voice cold as he cuffed Stevens. "You're going to answer for everything." The backup arrived just in time, and Stevens was taken into custody. Doug let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The danger wasn't over, but at least for now, they were safe. I hope you're still with me, because the story is only getting more intense. After the confrontation with Officer Stevens, Doug's body was still running on adrenaline. He watched as Stevens was taken into custody, his heart still racing from the fight. It felt like the storm had passed, but Doug knew it wasn't over yet. The real danger, the threat to Cynthia and Aisha, still loomed over them. He turned back to the safe house, his mind on high alert. It had been a long, hard night, and they still had to finish what they started. He couldn't let his guard down. He reached the house and stepped inside, finding Cynthia and Aisha sitting together, their faces tired but relieved. Aisha was hugging her mother, and Cynthia had tears in her eyes. Seeing them like this, Doug felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They were safe, at least for now, but the questions still remained. How had Stevens been involved? Who was really behind the trafficking operation? What had Cynthia gotten herself into? Doug could feel his resolve hardening. He needed to find answers, and he needed to make sure Cynthia and Aisha stayed safe. He couldn't rest until he was sure the danger was completely gone. "They got Stevens," Doug said, his voice calm but firm. "He was working with the syndicate. He tipped them off about the raid." Cynthia looked up at him, her face full of disbelief. "I never thought it was him," she whispered. "I thought we were all on the same side." Doug nodded, his mind still processing everything. "You weren't the only one who trusted him. We all did. But now we need to focus on what's next." He turned to Detective Morgan, who had just arrived with more backup. "We need to finish this. We need to find out who else is involved and make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Morgan nodded, her expression serious. "We've got the pieces, Doug. We're getting closer to the top of the organization. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more chance they'll slip through our fingers." Doug exhaled slowly, his mind working through the plan. "Where do we start?" he asked. "We've got a few locations we've identified. Safe houses, storage units. They're moving their operation, but we can hit them where it hurts," Morgan replied. "We'll need to hit them all at once, take down their entire network." Doug looked at Cynthia and Aisha one last time before turning to Morgan. "All right, let's do it. But we can't afford to miss anything. No one else is getting hurt on my watch." Morgan gave a quick nod, signaling for the team to prepare. Doug felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were going up against a powerful syndicate, one that wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Doug wasn't going to let them win. As they moved out, Doug stayed close to the team, ready for whatever came next. The streets were quiet as they made their way to the first location, a small warehouse on the outskirts of town. The plan was simple: hit them fast, hit them hard, and shut down their operations before they could regroup. As they arrived, Doug could feel the tension building. This wasn't just another raid. This was the final push to dismantle everything. "We move in 5, Morgan said, her voice steady. Doug's heart pounded in his chest as the officers readied their gear. He glanced at Cynthia, who had insisted on coming along, her face pale but determined. "You don't have to be here," Doug told her. "I need to be here," she replied softly. "I need to make sure this is over." Doug didn't argue. He understood. They all had a stake in this, but Cynthia's involvement made it personal. "Stay close," Doug said. He turned to the rest of the team. "Let's do this." The team moved into position, spreading out to cover the entrances. Doug and Morgan took the front, while the others took their spots around the back. The warehouse was quiet, too quiet. Doug's instincts screamed that they were walking into something bigger than they had anticipated. "Ready?" Morgan whispered. Doug nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the building. The plan was simple: breach, clear the rooms, and gather evidence. But Doug could feel the weight of it. This wasn't just about taking down a few criminals. It was about ending a network that had caused so much pain. "On 3, Morgan said, her voice sharp. 1, 2, 3. The door was kicked open with a force that shook the building, and the team stormed inside, weapons drawn. Doug led the way, his heart racing as he moved through the darkened warehouse. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the vast space, but there was no sign of movement. Doug quickly signaled to the team to clear the rooms. They moved quickly and quietly, sweeping the area with military precision. As they reached the back of the warehouse, Doug heard a noise, footsteps, muffled but distinct. He signaled for everyone to stop. The sound was coming from behind a stack of crates. Doug moved forward, his gun drawn, ready for anything. As he rounded the corner, he found what they were looking for, a man, bound and gagged, lying on the floor. It was one of the missing victims, someone who had been taken by the syndicate. Doug quickly moved to free him, but as he did, he heard more footsteps approaching. "Get down," Doug yelled, pushing the man out of the way. The team took cover as gunfire erupted from the other side of the warehouse. The battle was on. Doug's heart raced as he returned fire, his mind focused on keeping everyone safe. They had come too far to let it all slip away now. The fight was brutal, but with every shot, Doug knew they were getting closer to ending the syndicate's reign of terror. The battle wasn't over, but they were on the right track. The dawn was breaking, and Doug knew they couldn't stop until they had wiped them out completely. I hope you're still with me because the final moments of this journey are unfolding fast. After the chaos of the warehouse, Doug stood in the center of the destruction, breathing heavily. The battle had been intense, but the syndicate had finally been brought down. Cynthia was safe, and Aisha was waiting at the safe house, but there was still so much left to process. The officers moved through the building, collecting evidence, securing the area. Doug couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It wasn't just about stopping the criminals. It was about protecting people like Cynthia and Aisha, people who had been caught in the crossfire of a world they never asked to be part of. He looked around the warehouse one last time, the lights flickering overhead as he took it all in. The fight was over, but the scars would remain. Detective Morgan walked over to him, her face serious but soft with relief. "We've got them all, Doug," she said quietly. "Every last one of them." Doug nodded, his body still on high alert. "It's done, but we need to make sure it sticks. The last thing we want is for them to come back after we let our guard down." Morgan sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You're right. But for now, we've done what we set out to do." Doug felt the weight of her words, but the doubt in his mind was hard to shake. "I'll never understand how something like this can happen, especially to people like Cynthia and Aisha. They didn't deserve any of this." Morgan looked at him, her eyes softening. "No one deserves it. But you did your part, Doug. You helped them find safety, and you brought justice to a system that didn't care about them." Doug took a deep breath, letting the words settle in. He had done his job, but the emotional toll was harder to handle than the physical. "I just don't want to lose sight of what's important," Doug said, his voice cracking a little. "They're safe now, but there are so many more like them, and they're still out there." Morgan nodded in understanding. "That's why we have to keep going. This fight isn't over, but tonight, we won. And that matters." Doug couldn't argue with that. They had won, but the cost had been high. He glanced back at the officers securing the last of the evidence, and for the first time, he allowed himself to relax. The battle was over for now, but as he thought about Cynthia and Aisha, the promise he made to protect them remained in his mind. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had to make sure their lives would never again be at risk. He had to keep his promise, no matter the cost. With the police now in control of the scene, Doug made his way back to the safe house. The journey wasn't over, but this chapter was coming to a close. When he arrived, Aisha was waiting at the door, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice full of hope. Doug smiled, though it was faint. "It's over," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "You're safe now." Aisha threw her arms around him in a tight hug, and Doug held her, feeling a warmth that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Cynthia appeared behind her, looking tired but grateful. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved us." Doug gave a small nod. "You saved yourselves. I just helped." He stood up, looking between them both. "You don't have to worry about them anymore. You're going to be okay." Cynthia smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. "We owe you everything," she said, her eyes welling up. Doug shook his head. "No, you don't owe me anything. Just live your lives. That's all I wanted." He felt the weight of the moment, of the journey that had brought them all together, but he knew there was still work to be done. But for now, Cynthia and Aisha were safe, and that was enough. Doug stayed with them for a while longer, making sure they were settled before he left. He knew the world wasn't perfect, and the fight for justice wasn't over, But this was a victory. As he walked back to his car, the night air felt a little less heavy. It was a small comfort, but it was enough. Doug got in his car and drove off, knowing that whatever came next, he had made a difference. And in this world, that was enough.